Aloha, this is Ken O'Keefe in Gaza, and I'd like to tell my story of renouncing U.S. citizenship. It's an interesting one. First off, let me say that I decided that I would renounce my U.S. citizenship in my early 20s. I remember it very vividly. I was in a class in San Diego City College. I was taking a class, American History, from a black perspective. And this was in the period where I started to awaken to all the lies that are told to Americans. And when I was younger, I actually developed some real prejudices towards black people. You know, something that I realize now was due to pure ignorance of the facts and history. But so I took a class. I wanted to learn. And I took this American history class from a black perspective, and I started to learn all the lies told about the pervasive racism in America that was denied to me, the understanding of what really has happened to black people. And I remember taking that class and thinking, my God, you know, I could have been a racist. I could have been one of these ignorant fools, and nearly was. And when I learned all the things that we as a society have done to black people and still continue to do, I realized then I would renounce my U.S. citizenship at some point. And it didn't happen until many years later. But finally, I became involved in the Hawaiian independence movement. I learned about all the crimes America's committed against the Hawaiians, the Kanaka Maoris. I became a Hawaiian national, and I renounced my U.S. citizenship while living in Hawaii in 2001, March 1st, 2001. It's a very long process. You have to apply to the U.S. State Department for the paperwork. They send it to you. You fill it out, then you send it back to the State Department. You have to identify what country you will renounce, because you cannot do this inside the United States. And so I said I would do it in Canada, in Vancouver. That took many months, and finally I was given a date to renounce, and I actually traveled to Canada and renounced again on March 1st, 2001. You have to sign papers. I actually gave an addendum to the papers. You have to agree to many things. You put your hand up under oath, and you swear under oath, and then you also hand over your U.S. passport. Now I did this, but what I did was, because I was still living in Hawaii, and I explained in my renunciation statement that Hawaii was a sovereign nation and that was stolen by America in 1893 in an overthrow by U.S. officials and the landing of U.S. Marines. I gave all the details, and I made a film. It took me 8 months to make this film, The United States of Hypocrisy, and I explained all this in detail. Anyway, I returned to the U.S. on my birth certificate, Hawaii that is, the stolen nation of Hawaii. And when I came back, eventually the U.S. sent me back my passport in August of 2001 and said because I didn't leave the United States, totally ignored Hawaii, that I didn't actually mean to renounce U.S. citizenship. So then 9/11 happened. Now I knew what was happening on 9/11, unlike most Americans who were completely blind and ignorant and totally unaware of false flag operations. I knew. And I also knew that I couldn't keep my mouth shut about such things. Now America looked like pre-World War II Nazi Germany to me. American flags were flying everywhere. They looked like swastikas. A totally ignorant population being manipulated once again. I already had a large bench warrant for my arrest, $11,000. I'd already been a target for a couple of years at least, especially since renouncing citizenship, my involvement in the Hawaiian independence movement. 2 months after 9/11, living in Hawaii, I had everything you could want. I lived in paradise. I was the owner of my own business. I was doing something I loved, diving in the sea, teaching people to dive, whale watching tours. I was a captain and a dive instructor. I lived on the beach. I had money. I had a life most people would kill for, and yet I left all that in November of 2001. I learned about human rights law, asylum law, and I actually flew to Holland and I sought political asylum. Now the first thing I did was with that U.S. passport that America returned to me when I got to Holland in November 2001 was I renounced my U.S. citizenship a second time. When I did that, I had left the country and no intention of staying, going back. I actually formally entered the political asylum procedure in Holland. Now I armed myself with the understanding of human rights law, and despite the best efforts of the Dutch government and the world, which was largely sympathetic with America, also equally stupid in not understanding that America, and at that point I didn't know, but Israel were the perpetrators of 9/11, I sought political asylum. I managed, because of my knowledge of law and the knowledge of the system and the tyranny that is pervasive throughout Western culture and governments, I managed to get into that system. There's two ways in the asylum procedure. They try and get you out within 4 days. They tried to get me out, the Dutch government did. They committed a fraud saying I had signed something in my application saying they could remove critical documents to my case. I caught them at it, and ultimately they were forced to put me into the long procedure. I lived in a refugee camp in Holland. I had an incredible experience meeting people from all around the world, hearing their stories, and so I was in that procedure. Eventually I got the best attorney in Holland, Peter Bulgars, to represent me pro bono, and so I was living in Holland. Later in 2002, in July of 2002, the US returned my second passport to me. This time they said because I did not have citizenship with another nation that I did not have the ability to renounce. Now this is really quite ridiculous, as the document you'll see I'm putting on the screen. It says in the document quite clearly, one, you have the right to renounce US citizenship, and two, if you do not possess citizenship of another nation upon renunciation, you will become a, quote, stateless person. Now, not only did I accept these terms, in my addendum to the renunciation, I actually said I demand to be stateless. I did not want to be an American citizen. Ultimately, the US gave me back that passport, however. This is the first passport I burned in July of 2002.
And I cannot in any way associate myself with a nation that involves itself with such horrendous policies. The United States has been formally served with the legal notice of that. They have 30 days to object. If they do not provide an objection to me, then that will be my legal proof and evidence that I am not a U.S. citizen. And the United States has no right to determine my political status. I determine my political status, as does every human being.
The United States does not determine the right of self-determination. A person and a nation determines their right of self-determination. That is why I burned that passport. I never would have done it if the US would have just accepted my renunciation in the first place. Later in 2002, I watched as the build-up to the invasion of Iraq occurred. It made me angry, quite frankly. It made me angry as well that Western people thought that protests were going to stop this war. I knew the invasion of Iraq was coming. I knew it was about oil, and I knew it was about setting up permanent military bases in the region. And so I initiated the Human Shield Action to Iraq. I argued then and I argue now that if enough of us really cared in the West, if we would have got thousands of Westerners down to Iraq and positioned ourselves at places that are supposed to be protected by the Geneva Conventions, that we could have stopped that war by making it politically untenable. And the way you make things untenable is you put Western lives in there, because Western lives are not valued like Iraqi lives, Palestinian lives, and every other dark-skinned people's lives. Apparently our lives are worth more. So in that situation, in this total inequitable world that we live in, we should be using our lives to try and bolster up the rights of other people, and that was my argument then and now. Anyway, I initiated the Human Shield Action to Iraq. Thousands and thousands of people inquired. Unfortunately, it was infiltrated and subverted from the inside, but we still managed to have 3 double-decker buses that traveled from London to Baghdad. Now along the way I had no US passport because I had given it up, I had burned it, and I had no citizenship. I had not acquired my Irish passport, my Irish citizenship at that point. So on my way I traveled through Europe without a problem, but ironically I made it to Turkey, and when I got to Turkey, the Turkish government was very afraid of me, quite frankly. I had a large audience in Turkey at that point because I was saying that if Turkey, the government of Turkey, allowed the US to use Turkey as a base for the American imperialist machine to bomb their brothers and sisters, their fellow Muslims in Iraq, that all options were on the table. Revolution would be an open option if the Turkish government committed treason allowing the US government to do that. So when I arrived in Turkey, the officials took me away because it was a full-on paparazzi scene. I was having questions fired at me from all the Turkish media. They pulled me into a back room. They looked at my documents. I handed over my world citizen passport, which was the only thing I had at the time, and they promptly deported me for handing over a fraudulent document. So I was sent to Italy, actually, and there I was, the leader of the Human Shield convoy, Human Shield Action, stuck in Italy, not able to travel to Iraq while the rest of the convoy and the buses were heading to Baghdad. What did I do? I was forced, under duress, and it was very painful, I can tell you, to go to the American embassy in Rome and request a US passport so that I could travel to Iraq in order to oppose the invasion of Iraq. That is what I did. That is called under duress. I traveled to Iraq, and the Human Shield Action did not succeed in its ultimate goal of stopping the invasion, although it did protect 6 sites in Baghdad, which was important because it meant electricity and water were supplied to people in Baghdad. It may not make the news over in the rest of the world, but to Iraqi mothers who were able to provide water and had electricity during shock and awe, it meant something. Anyway, that US passport, I hated it, I didn't want it. Ultimately, I went back to Baghdad a year later in 2004, at great personal risk, I must say. This was not an easy thing to do, and quite frankly, I didn't know if I would make it out of Baghdad since I was hated already, and plus all the collaborators with the US, the fake Al-Qaeda agents and all this stuff. I went to Baghdad with that passport I was forced to get. I went and I burned that passport. I made another statement as to why I was not a US citizen. Now by that point I actually had my Irish citizenship, so I was able to travel on the Irish passport. I burned that US passport in Baghdad at Firdos Square, and right where Saddam Hussein's statue was tumbled, and I renounced my US citizenship a third time. I probably have the Guinness Book of World Records of renouncing US citizenship. So I did this a third time, and then I left. Now to this day, the United States still considers me a US citizen. Despite all of this, I have not lived in the United States since 2001. I went back to Hawaii for a period of time, but I did not stay as a resident. I don't vote in the sham American elections. I don't pay taxes, nor would I. I would go to prison before I would pay the blood money of American taxes, which are being used to murder my brothers and sisters in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and all over the rest of the world, Vietnam, and so many other places. Under US law, a US citizen, which is what the US considers me to be, is compelled to have a US passport in order to travel back to the States. Now I had gone around this before when I went back to see my family by going through Canada, but when I went to Canada a couple years before that, the Canadians put me in jail for 2 days without charges, capitulating to Israeli and American tyranny. And so I thought, okay, this time I will go to, in 2010, I will try and fly into the States on my Irish passport. Now when I did that, I went to the airport, and the Department of so-called Homeland Security of the United States told the airlines not to let me on board the plane. I ended up losing my ticket. I lost a ticket for £450, which for me is a lot of money. I don't have money to throw away. So ultimately, in order to go see my mother last year, I was compelled once again to go to the American Embassy, this time in London, and request a passport. Now I had a 6-month passport, and I joked with the guys who knew my story in the embassy there. This is ridiculous. I have an Irish passport. I'm not an American citizen. Why you guys do this? Why are you compelling me to get a frickin' passport that I don't want? Bar me from the country then. The bottom line to know about this is I don't live in the US. I don't pay taxes to the US. I don't condone, in fact I condemn the United States on every level for its tyranny, its corruption, and its horrendous behavior around the world. How is it possible that I would be considered a US citizen simply because, under duress, I have used a US passport in order to exercise the right to travel? If you believe that, you're a fool. More likely you're an agent of the Zionists and the other side, and you simply want to attack me either for reasons of jealousy or because you're an agent and you're trying to destroy my character. Good luck to you. You're going to have to make things up. The bottom line is the right of self-determination is an inherent human right, and in a better world, everyone will be able to exercise that right and many others. And I am not a US citizen, regardless of the fact that I have been compelled to use US passports, and ultimately, I am a national of Palestine and Hawaii and Ireland, but my ultimate allegiance is to my entire human family. Nothing will change that, and I will never give my allegiance to one nation at the expense of the rest of my fellow brothers and sisters around the world. So, I am not a US citizen, and I am not going to relinquish my right of self-determination, but I will not relinquish my right to travel. So, there's the story of renunciation. Now there are some more details in there, but that's the truth. Take it for what you will, I don't really care, but for the record, there you have it.